Enough is enough. For too long, the powerful have abused their authority, leaving ordinary people to suffer in silence. This trial isn't just about one case. It's a blatant reminder of a system rigged to protect those who exploit it. The evidence laid bare today exposes a deep-seated corruption and a gross disregard for truth. It's time to let our outrage be heard and demand accountability, because when justice is sold to the highest bidder, no one is truly free. The early morning light filtered through the towering windows of the Granite City Courthouse, casting a soft glow upon the marble floors and polished wood panels. The building, an architectural masterpiece of neoclassical design, had long stood as a symbol of justice and order. Yet on this particular day, its solemn halls were filled with an electrifying tension, a prelude to a trial that promised to challenge the very foundations of truth and authority. In the heart of downtown Granite City, the courthouse was buzzing with activity. Local reporters hustled through the corridors, their notepads and cameras at the ready, while a crowd of curious citizens gathered outside, eager to witness the unfolding of an event that had already set the city abuzz. Among the throng was an undercurrent of anticipation and unease, a shared sentiment that justice, in its purest form, was about to be put to the test. At the center of this storm was Lieutenant Commander Isabella Cortez. Dressed in a modest yet sharply tailored navy blue blazer and crisp white blouse, Isabella exuded an air of unyielding dignity. Her dark eyes, reflecting both determination and a trace of sorrow, were fixed on the imposing entrance of the courtroom. Behind her calm exterior lay a turbulent history, one marked by years of sacrifice and service as a decorated Navy SEAL. Now, rather than the battlefield, Isabella was poised to face a different kind of combat. A legal battle where words, evidence, and the weight of authority would be her adversaries. Across the courtroom, on the plaintiff's side, sat Officer Marcus Dalton. Clad in his pristine uniform, his posture exuded confidence, perhaps too much. His expression, at first, appeared to be that of a man who was in full control of the situation, a guardian of order. But there was a subtle undercurrent in his gaze, a mix of arrogance and hidden uncertainty that hinted at the complexity of the events he was about to recount. The gallery was a tapestry of emotions. Local townspeople, journalists, and community activists, each with their own vested interest in the outcome of this case. Their murmurs and exchanged glances filled the room with a palpable energy that made it clear this was no ordinary trial. It was a moment where societal fractures, long suppressed by time and decorum, were finally being brought to the surface. As the session began, the judge, a seasoned magistrate known as Judge Harrison, entered with a measured gait and an expression that conveyed both authority and a weary empathy born of years grappling with the weight of human frailty. His presence was a quiet reminder of the responsibility he bore, to ensure that the scales of justice remained balanced, even when they trembled under the strain of conflicting narratives. In that moment, the courtroom transformed into a stage where each participant played a role in a drama that transcended legal procedure. The quiet rustle of papers, the faint hum of the overhead lights, and the occasional creak of the wooden benches became the backdrop to a tale of defiance, betrayal, and the relentless pursuit of truth. Isabella took her place at the defense table with a poised yet unyielding grace that spoke volumes about her character. Every movement she made was deliberate, her every glance imbued with the quiet strength of a warrior who had weathered countless storms. Yet behind those resolute eyes was a reservoir of pain, a narrative of hardship and prejudice that had shaped her life long before she ever donned the uniform of a Navy SEAL. This was a woman who had spent 2 decades defending her country against its enemies, only to find herself on the defensive in her own homeland. As the proceedings advanced, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew increasingly charged with a mix of hope and apprehension. The prosecution wasted no time in presenting their case, their narrative constructed meticulously around the testimony of Officer Dalton. According to his account, Isabella had been seen loitering near a closed business in a quiet corner of Granite City, a seemingly mundane detail that was twisted into a narrative of suspicion and aggression. Dalton's voice, firm and unwavering, resonated throughout the room as he described how, on that fateful day, he confronted Isabella under circumstances that he claimed had escalated into physical resistance. Every word he spoke was measured, yet the underlying tone carried an unmistakable note of self-assurance. The prosecution's portrayal was one of an individual whose actions, according to them, posed a threat to public order, a narrative bolstered by the symbolic weight of his uniform and the authority it commanded. However, as Dalton recounted his version of events, there were subtle hesitations, fleeting moments where his confidence wavered. Those small cracks in his testimony did not go unnoticed by the attentive eyes of the audience, and they sowed the seeds of doubt that would later grow into a powerful counter-narrative. The stage was set. The defense was prepared to challenge every assertion, every detail that had been so carefully constructed by the prosecution. In the hushed silence that followed the officer's testimony, there was an almost tangible shift in the energy of the room. The once rigid lines between right and wrong began to blur, replaced by an emerging narrative of a flawed system, one that could manipulate perceptions and distort the truth for the sake of authority. For Isabella, the courtroom was more than just a venue for legal contestation. It was a battleground where her integrity, her service, and her very identity were on trial. The contrast between her unassuming yet resolute demeanor and the bold, almost theatrical manner of Officer Dalton was stark. Her presence challenged not just the specifics of the case but the entire paradigm that allowed a figure of authority to present a one-sided story without scrutiny. The spectators, too, were not passive onlookers. They were emotionally invested in the unfolding drama, their faces mirroring the spectrum of human sentiment, from skepticism to admiration, from anger to a quiet, burning hope. Each individual in the gallery brought with them a personal history of encounters with authority and injustice. And in witnessing Isabella's calm defiance, many found a reflection of their own struggles. It was as if the trial had transcended its legal parameters, becoming a mirror through which the community could confront the broader issues of systemic bias and the misuse of power. In the midst of this charged environment, Isabella's story began to take shape as more than just a defense against a set of allegations. It evolved into a broader commentary on the nature of truth and the courage required to confront an oppressive system. The underlying narrative was no longer confined to the specifics of one incident. It was a call to recognize the deeper scars left by injustice, a testament to the resilience of those who refused to be defined by their circumstances. As the opening statements drew to a close, the courtroom was left with an air of expectancy, as if it were on the brink of witnessing a seismic shift in the narrative of justice. The stage had been set, the players had taken their positions, and the first act of this intricate drama was complete. Every detail, the polished corridors of the courthouse, the meticulously arranged seats, the hushed whispers of the audience, conspired to create an atmosphere where truth was not just a concept, but a force waiting to be unleashed. In this charged moment, Isabella's gaze swept over the courtroom. There was a silent promise in her eyes, a vow that she would not be intimidated, that she would confront every challenge with the same unyielding determination that had carried her through years of adversity. Her story was one of sacrifice, of battles fought on distant shores, and now it was a battle for dignity in a place where power often reigned unchecked. As the echoes of her quiet resolve reverberated through the hallowed halls of the courthouse, one could not help but wonder. In a world where authority is often taken at face value, how does one truly find the strength to stand against it? What does it take to not only challenge a narrative that has been so meticulously crafted but also to inspire others to do the same? What do you think is the most powerful quality that helps someone stand up against injustice? The courtroom's charged atmosphere carried over from the opening act, as if every soul present knew that nothing short of a dramatic revelation was imminent. With the opening statements concluded, the trial shifted into the phase of testimonies and cross-examinations, a stage where every word, every gesture, would be scrutinized not only by the judge and jury, but by an audience hungry for justice. Lieutenant Commander Isabella Cortez sat at the defense table with a quiet intensity that belied the turbulent storm within her. The weight of her past, of decades spent in service and sacrifice, pressed gently against her like an old, familiar companion. Every time her gaze met that of a skeptical juror or an inquisitive reporter, a silent promise passed between them. The truth would not be hidden for long. Officer Marcus Dalton, meanwhile, returned to the stand with a measured air of determination. He had already established himself as the prosecution's primary witness, and now, under the unyielding scrutiny of the defense attorney, his narrative would be dissected in painstaking detail. The prosecution sought to paint him as a figure of unwavering authority, a man who had maintained order in the face of chaos. However, as the cross-examination began, the carefully constructed facade started to show its first signs of cracking. Benjamin Carter, the defense attorney, a man whose calm yet resolute demeanor had earned him respect both inside and outside the courtroom, rose to challenge Dalton's testimony. His voice, smooth and deliberate, cut through the murmurs of the gallery as he began his line of questioning. "Officer Dalton," Benjamin addressed him, his tone courteous yet probing. "You testified that you encountered Lieutenant Commander Cortez near a closed storefront on the outskirts of Westwood District. Can you describe in detail the circumstances under which you approached her?" Dalton's eyes flickered momentarily before he responded, his tone measured. "I was on routine patrol when I noticed her lingering in an area known for petty disturbances. When I approached, she appeared evasive and uncooperative. I asked for her identification, and that's when the situation escalated." The defense lawyer paused, allowing the weight of Dalton's words to hang in the air. "Uncooperative? Could you clarify what you meant by that? What specific actions did you witness that compelled you to conclude that Ms. Cortez was, in fact, acting in a suspicious manner?" Dalton's expression tightened. She hesitated, and then there was a brief exchange where she questioned my request. "I believe her behavior suggested resistance." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Benjamin leaned forward, his eyes locked onto Dalton's. "Isn't it true that sometimes a simple request for identification, when met with confusion, might simply be a matter of concern or misunderstanding rather than resistance?" Dalton's answer wavered under the steady pressure of the questioning. "In high-tension situations, a moment's hesitation can be misinterpreted, but I assure you, my actions were based on maintaining safety." Benjamin's next question was even more pointed. "Officer Dalton, you claim that Ms. Cortez resisted physically when you attempted to detain her. However, a video recording from a bystander clearly shows Ms. Cortez standing calmly, not engaging in any aggressive behavior. Can you explain that discrepancy?" Dalton's composure began to falter. The defense had already introduced video evidence, a shaky yet damning record that contradicted his account. His eyes darted briefly to the screen mounted on the courtroom wall, then back to Benjamin. "Video evidence can be misleading," he stammered. "The angle might not capture the full context of the situation." Benjamin's voice grew firmer. "Misleading, officer? Or is it that the evidence you've presented does not align with the physical actions you described? No fingerprints on your holster, no corroborative testimony from your colleagues, just your word." The tension in the courtroom mounted. Dalton's voice, once confident, now trembled with uncertainty. Each question by Benjamin peeled back another layer of the prosecution's narrative, exposing a series of inconsistencies that threatened to undermine the credibility of Officer Dalton's testimony. As the cross-examination proceeded, Benjamin shifted focus. "Officer Dalton, you mentioned that you were enforcing protocols in an area known for disturbances. Are you aware that Ms. Cortez had been in that area to visit a community center and was known to many local residents for her volunteer work?" The question elicited a brief, awkward pause from Dalton, who seemed unprepared for this line of inquiry. "I was not informed of her personal activities," he replied, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his tone. "My duty is to ensure public safety, not to delve into personal matters." Yet, the implication was clear. The prosecution's narrative was not as airtight as it was portrayed to be. The defense was carefully weaving an alternative story, a story where the very act of questioning authority was framed not as defiance, but as a call for clarity and justice. Throughout this intense exchange, the atmosphere in the courtroom oscillated between moments of silent anticipation and bursts of murmured conversations among the onlookers. Every word uttered in the witness stand seemed to carry the potential to shift the balance of the case. In that microcosm of justice, the truth was not merely an abstract concept. It was a living, breathing entity, struggling to be recognized amidst a sea of conflicting accounts. While Officer Dalton grappled with the pointed questions, a palpable sense of unease began to permeate the defense's side. Lieutenant Commander Cortez, seated quietly at the defense table, maintained her composed demeanor, her eyes occasionally glancing toward the jury. Her presence was a stark contrast to the disintegrating confidence of Officer Dalton. In those silent moments, her past experiences, the discipline, the valor, the unwavering commitment to her country, spoke louder than words. They reminded everyone present that this was not just a battle of narratives, but a profound contest between integrity and the abuse of power. The defense's cross-examination reached a crescendo when Benjamin presented a series of documents. These documents, meticulously gathered over weeks of investigation, detailed previous complaints lodged against Officer Dalton, instances of excessive use of force, allegations of racial bias, and discrepancies in his official records. As Benjamin methodically presented this evidence, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Each document was a blow to the prosecution's case, challenging the very foundation upon which it had been built. "Officer Dalton," Benjamin said, his voice resolute and unwavering, "can you account for these discrepancies? Can you explain why there is a pattern of behavior in your records that suggests a tendency towards actions beyond what is acceptable under protocol?" Dalton's face flushed, and his eyes darted around the room as if seeking an escape. For a fleeting moment, the veneer of authority that had so long defined him was gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded vulnerability. The documents on display were more than just pieces of paper. They were symbols of a broader systemic issue, evidence that the institution meant to protect and serve was, in this instance, failing those it was sworn to defend. The gravity of the situation was not lost on anyone in the courtroom. The defense had not only discredited Officer Dalton's testimony, but had also planted a seed of doubt about the entire system. A system that, if left unchecked, could continue to trample the rights of individuals in the name of order and authority. As the cross-examination drew to a close, the courtroom was enveloped in a heavy silence. The prosecution's case, once portrayed as unassailable, now lay in tatters, its pieces scattered by the relentless probing of the defense. The jury, whose duty it was to weigh the evidence with impartiality, appeared visibly affected. Their expressions were a tapestry of contemplation, empathy, and cautious optimism, a collective acknowledgement that truth was a multifaceted entity, often obscured by the haze of personal bias and institutional power. Lieutenant Commander Cortez, still seated at the defense table, finally allowed herself a brief moment to exhale. Her eyes, steely and determined, met those of her defense team, silently conveying that this was only the beginning. The trial was far from over. There were still many layers to peel back, many truths to be unearthed. But in that moment, a small victory had been achieved. A victory not only for her, but for everyone who had ever doubted the possibility of justice in the face of overwhelming authority. In the hushed aftermath of the testimony, the judge called for a short recess. As the courtroom slowly emptied into the corridors and waiting areas, the tension remained palpable, hanging in the air like a charged current. Outside, the gathered crowd buzzed with renewed fervor. Whispers of potential injustice, murmurs of hope, and discussions of accountability filled the space, a microcosm of the broader societal debates that the trial had come to represent. For many, the unfolding of the day's events was not merely a legal proceeding. It was a mirror reflecting the struggles of everyday citizens against systemic abuses. The trial was becoming a beacon, a call to question authority and demand transparency. And at its heart stood Lieutenant Commander Isabella Cortez, a woman whose life, marked by courage and sacrifice, had become emblematic of the enduring quest for truth and dignity. As the recess came to an end, Benjamin Carter prepared his notes for the next phase of the trial. His mind raced with strategies, each one aimed at further dismantling the prosecution's narrative. He knew that the coming hours would demand even greater precision and passion, a performance where every detail mattered, where the scales of justice balanced precariously between truth and deception. Before the session resumed, A brief moment of informal discussion took place in the courthouse corridors. Journalists, legal experts, and community activists exchanged theories and speculations, each one dissecting the evidence that had been laid bare in the courtroom. The tension was universal, a shared recognition that the trial was evolving into something much larger than the fate of a single individual. It was about accountability, the integrity of those in power, and the right of every citizen to be treated with fairness and respect. As participants filed back into the courtroom for the next round of proceedings, the energy was palpable. The stage was set for further revelations, for the dramatic unveiling of more secrets that lay hidden behind closed doors. Every eye was fixed on the defense table, every ear attuned to the quiet determination of Lieutenant Commander Cortez. The battle for truth was far from over, and as the gavel prepared to signal the resumption of the trial, a final thought lingered in the minds of those present. How do you think exposing past misconduct influences the credibility of a witness in a trial? The courtroom returned to order with an energy that was both restless and expectant, as if every eye in the room was poised on the brink of an unprecedented revelation. The atmosphere, already dense from the previous exchanges, had grown even more charged as the next phase of the trial was set to commence. Participants, jurors, legal teams, and spectators alike sat in rapt attention, knowing that every word spoken now could tilt the scales of justice further in one direction or another. As the session resumed, Judge Harrison's measured voice cut through the lingering murmurs. We shall now proceed with additional testimonies. Counsel, please call your next witness. The room fell silent, and a brief pause allowed the anticipation to mount. Benjamin Carter, the defense attorney, exchanged a determined glance with Lieutenant Commander Isabella Cortez, whose steady eyes betrayed the burden of her past and the resolve of her present. Benjamin motioned for the next witness, a bystander whose account had the potential to bridge the gap between conflicting testimonies. The witness, a local community organizer named Evelyn Rivera, stepped forward with a composed yet visibly anxious air. Clad in a simple blouse and jeans, Evelyn's presence was a stark reminder that the truth often lay in the details unnoticed by those entrenched in power. Ms. Rivera, Benjamin began, his tone gentle yet insistent, could you please recount what you witnessed on the day in question? Evelyn took a deep breath and began. I was on my way home from a community meeting when I passed by the Westwood district. I saw Lieutenant Commander Cortez standing near the community center. I noticed Officer Dalton approaching her with his standard-issue flashlight and uniform. What struck me most was the calm she maintained, even when the situation seemed to escalate. Her voice wavered slightly as she recalled the event, yet there was an underlying strength in her words. I recorded a brief clip on my phone, not intending it to serve as evidence, but I later realized it captured moments that contradicted the official account. Her testimony sent a ripple of murmurs through the courtroom. Benjamin's eyes narrowed with a mix of satisfaction and urgency. Ms. Rivera, can you describe what you recorded? What exactly did you see that night? Evelyn's eyes glistened with the weight of memory. I saw Officer Dalton's gestures. He seemed more agitated than necessary. While he was speaking, I noticed that his hand was trembling as he held his flashlight. More importantly, the footage clearly showed that Lieutenant Commander Cortez never acted aggressively. Instead, she maintained an open stance, her hands visible, as if she was simply trying to explain herself. There was a moment when her voice, though soft, resonated with such authority that it seemed to momentarily quiet even the tension in the air. The defense attorney nodded, allowing Evelyn's words to hang in the charged silence. Judge Harrison interjected, Ms. Rivera, I understand this must be difficult, but could you also share if there were any other details that you think might be relevant? Evelyn hesitated, as if weighing the gravity of her own memories. Yes, Your Honor. I noticed that Officer Dalton's uniform seemed immaculate at first, but as the encounter continued, I observed subtle signs of disarray. His tie was slightly askew, and his demeanor, normally so confident, appeared to falter. It was as if the pressure of the situation was beginning to overwhelm him. I believe these details might indicate that he was less in control than he had portrayed. Benjamin's voice rose with quiet conviction. And so, Ms. Rivera, Would you agree that these observations support the notion that Lieutenant Commander Cortez was not the aggressor as Officer Dalton suggests, but rather the one who was unjustly treated? Evelyn met Benjamin's gaze steadily before replying, "Yes, I believe so. It appeared to me that she was caught in a situation that was being misrepresented, a situation where the truth was obscured by a narrative designed to shift blame." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. The defense had not only reinforced the earlier video evidence, but also humanized the events through Evelyn's detailed recollection. Her testimony began to shift the perception of many jurors, casting a shadow over the prosecution's earlier portrayal of events. As Evelyn concluded her testimony, the prosecution was given an opportunity to cross-examine. Officer Dalton returned to the stand once more, his face now etched with the strain of multiple rounds of questioning. His eyes, once brimming with unchallenged authority, now darted nervously as he tried to reconcile Evelyn's account with his own recollections. "Officer Dalton," the prosecutor's voice cut through the tension, "how do you explain the discrepancies between your initial statement and the testimony provided by Ms. Rivera? Specifically, why do you think her observations of your behavior differ so markedly from your account?" Dalton's response was hesitant. I think there might be differences in perception. In the heat of the moment, one might see things differently." His words, however, lacked the conviction that had characterized his earlier statements, and the jury's expressions shifted ever so slightly, an indication that the foundation of his narrative was beginning to crumble. Benjamin seized the moment. "Officer Dalton, if you truly believe that your account was accurate, why would there be such clear visual evidence and independent testimony that suggests otherwise? Isn't it possible that the stress of the situation led you to misinterpret the behavior of Lieutenant Commander Cortez?" The tension was palpable as Dalton stammered an answer, each word measured, yet failing to bridge the gap between his recollections and the emerging evidence. The prosecution's case, already weakened by earlier inconsistencies, now appeared increasingly untenable. Meanwhile, in the gallery, the audience was visibly moved by the unfolding events. Whispers of disbelief, empathy, and even indignation filled the air. Many viewers, who had come to the courthouse seeking justice, now found themselves questioning the integrity of those in uniform. The trial was evolving into more than just a legal proceeding. It was becoming a crucible for broader societal reflection on authority, bias, and accountability. As the cross-examinations continued, the defense called upon additional witnesses, colleagues of Lieutenant Commander Cortez who attested to her reputation for calm under pressure and her steadfast commitment to fairness. Their testimonies, rich in detail and imbued with a palpable respect for her character, further eroded the narrative that had been meticulously crafted by the prosecution. One by one, each witness painted a portrait of a woman who had faced formidable challenges throughout her military career, yet had always maintained her dignity and compassion. One particularly poignant moment came when a former commanding officer took the stand. His weathered face and sincere tone conveyed years of shared experiences with Lieutenant Commander Cortez. "I have served alongside Isabella for many years," he said, his voice steady and filled with both pride and sorrow. "In the most challenging times, she has been a beacon of resolve and integrity. To suggest that she would behave in the manner described by Officer Dalton is not only untrue but an affront to everything she has stood for throughout her career." The courtroom absorbed his words with a mixture of reverence and contemplation. The testimony did not merely serve as evidence. It resonated deeply with everyone present, reminding them of the human element often lost in the mechanistic proceedings of a trial. As the day progressed, the cumulative effect of these revelations began to shift the mood of the courtroom. What had initially been a battle of rigid narratives was now a dynamic interplay of truths emerging from different corners. The prosecution's arguments, once forceful and unyielding, now appeared increasingly isolated against a backdrop of mounting evidence and testimony in support of Lieutenant Commander Cortez. Judge Harrison, ever the arbiter of order and justice, took a moment during a brief recess to address the gathered media outside the courthouse. "We are witnessing the unfolding of a case that transcends individual allegations. It challenges us to confront deeper issues within our system. Let the evidence speak, and let us be guided by truth." His words, though measured, carried the weight of a man who had seen too many lives upended by the failures of institutional power. Inside the courtroom, the defense team huddled briefly, strategizing for the remainder of the trial. Benjamin Carter's eyes gleamed with a mix of determination and quiet satisfaction. Every witness, every piece of evidence, is a step closer to revealing the full truth, he murmured, his voice barely audible yet laden with conviction. We're not just fighting a case. We're fighting for the integrity of our justice system. Lieutenant Commander Cortez, sitting with unwavering composure, listened intently. The gravity of her situation was not lost on her, yet she remained resolute. She knew that every moment in that courtroom was a battle not just for her freedom, but for the principles that defined her life: honor, service, and the relentless pursuit of justice. As the session neared its end, the judge called for a recess to allow both sides to prepare for the next phase of the proceedings. The murmurs in the room had subsided into a heavy, thoughtful silence. A collective breath held in anticipation of what revelations the coming hours might bring. Outside, the crowd's energy had transformed from mere curiosity to an active engagement with the unfolding drama. People discussed passionately in small groups, some visibly moved by the courage of Lieutenant Commander Cortez, while others expressed concern over the apparent breakdown of established authority. It was a moment of communal reflection, a reminder that justice was not merely a legal outcome, but a reflection of the society's collective conscience. Before the recess concluded, a final interactive moment emerged as Benjamin, standing near the defense table, addressed the gallery with a quiet intensity. As we await the next phase of this trial, I ask you, what do you believe is the most critical factor in ensuring that justice is served when faced with conflicting narratives? His question hung in the air, inviting everyone to ponder the delicate balance between authority and truth. In that charged atmosphere, with every detail meticulously unfolding and every witness adding a new layer to the emerging story, it became clear that this trial was more than just a legal battle. It was a profound exploration of the human spirit, a testament to the resilience required to confront systemic injustice, and a call to each individual to reflect on the true meaning of accountability. What aspect of a witness's character do you think most influences the credibility of their testimony in a high-stakes trial? As the trial entered its fourth act, the air inside the Granite City Courthouse grew denser, charged with anticipation, frustration, and the weight of truths yet to be fully revealed. The previous testimonies and evidence had steadily dismantled the prosecution's narrative, but now, both sides prepared for the moment that would ultimately redefine the entire case. Every attendee in the courtroom sensed that a turning point was imminent, as if the scales of justice were poised on a knife's edge, waiting for that decisive nudge toward clarity. Judge Harrison, his face solemn and his eyes reflecting decades of hard-won wisdom, signaled that the session was about to resume. The gavel struck with a firm yet measured rhythm, calling the room to order. All conversations ceased, replaced by an expectant silence that blanketed the room like a shroud. Every witness, every lawyer, and every juror was now a part of this unfolding drama, each aware that the next series of revelations might irrevocably alter the course of justice. Benjamin Carter, the defense attorney whose piercing questions had already rattled the prosecution's case, rose once more to address the court. His voice, steady and imbued with a quiet intensity, carried the conviction of someone who believed wholeheartedly in the power of truth. Your Honor, I submit that the evidence we have presented thus far only scratches the surface of a much deeper systemic issue. He began, gesturing toward a series of documents laid out on his table. We are prepared to introduce further evidence that speaks not only to the events of that day, but to a pattern of behavior that calls into question the very integrity of the testimony provided by Officer Marcus Dalton. A murmur rippled through the gallery at his words. The defense had been meticulously building its case, and now it appeared that their final piece of evidence would not only challenge Officer Dalton's version of events, but also shed light on his long history of misconduct. As Benjamin spoke, he signaled to a courtroom technician to bring up a series of archived files and recordings that had been gathered over the course of several months. The large screen mounted on the wall flickered to life, displaying a montage of internal memos, disciplinary records, and video snippets. all carefully curated to illustrate a troubling pattern in Officer Dalton's conduct. The montage opened with a dated video clip showing Officer Dalton during a routine patrol, his demeanor markedly less confident than he had portrayed in his testimony. In the clip, his hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his flashlight, and his voice, though professional, carried a hint of uncertainty. The footage was juxtaposed with internal documents that revealed a series of complaints filed against him. Complaints ranging from excessive use of force to alleged instances of racial bias that had been quietly dismissed by his superiors. Each piece of evidence was a testament to a larger narrative, one in which the authority entrusted to him was marred by a pattern of questionable behavior. As the montage continued, the courtroom was swept into a collective state of disbelief and indignation. Jurors exchanged glances that spoke volumes, silent acknowledgments that the evidence unfolding before them was not just a rebuttal, but a seismic shift in the entire case. The prosecutor, Richard Avery, sat rigidly, his confident veneer beginning to crack under the force of the revelations. Even Judge Harrison's steely gaze softened ever so slightly, a hint of concern shadowing his features as he absorbed the implications of what was being presented. When the montage concluded, Benjamin Carter stepped forward to emphasize its significance. "Officer Dalton," he said, addressing the witness directly, "how do you reconcile this evidence with your testimony? How do you explain the discrepancies between your actions, as recorded and documented here, and the narrative you offered to this court?" For a moment, the courtroom was silent, save for the sound of Benjamin's measured tone. Officer Dalton's eyes darted across the screen, his face flushing with a mixture of frustration and resignation. He hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. There are moments when stress affects one's behavior," he offered, his response unconvincing in its vagueness. Benjamin pressed on, his voice rising ever so slightly with the passion of a man who had seen truth emerge from the shadows. "Stress does not account for a documented history of misconduct, nor does it explain why independent witnesses have repeatedly observed behavior that contradicts your account. Isn't it time that we confronted the reality of a system that protects its own at the expense of truth and justice?" The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Around the courtroom, members of the public leaned forward, their expressions a mix of astonishment and resolve. It was as though Benjamin's challenge had sparked a collective awakening, a realization that the trial was about so much more than one disputed encounter. It was about accountability at every level. In a subsequent exchange, the defense called upon a new witness, a seasoned internal affairs investigator named Dominic Reyes. With a calm yet authoritative presence, Reyes recounted his own investigations into Officer Dalton's past behavior. "Over the past 3 years, I have reviewed numerous cases involving Officer Dalton," he stated, his voice even and resolute. What emerged was a troubling pattern. Incidents where excessive force was used without justification. Instances where racial profiling was not only suspected, but corroborated by multiple independent sources. His testimony was methodical and precise, detailing dates, times, and outcomes of previous investigations that had been quietly swept under the rug by a system more concerned with reputation than with justice. Dominic's words were met with a palpable tension in the room. For many, his testimony was the culmination of years of suppressed frustration, a validation that their own experiences with systemic bias and unchecked authority were not isolated incidents but part of a broader malaise. As Dominic finished his account, Benjamin turned his attention back to Officer Dalton. "Do you have any response to these allegations? Can you provide any evidence to counter this documented history?" His question was pointed, leaving little room for evasion. Officer Dalton's inability to provide a satisfactory answer deepened the growing sense of injustice among the audience. His once unassailable posture was now replaced by one of discomfort and retreat. The defense's evidence had not only undermined his credibility but had also cast a long shadow over the prosecution's entire case. The jury, whose duty it was to impartially assess the facts, now seemed visibly moved by the weight of the evidence, an evidence that suggested a troubling pattern of behavior within the ranks of those sworn to uphold the law. As the session progressed, new exhibits were introduced: emails, internal reports, and even recordings of conversations among senior officers that hinted at a culture of silence and complicity. One particularly damning piece of evidence was an email exchange between Officer Dalton and a supervisor, in which he was advised to keep a low profile regarding a minor incident that, in hindsight, took on monumental significance in the context of his overall conduct. The email was a stark reminder that the issues at hand were not isolated but were symptomatic of a deeper, systemic failure. The defense's strategy was clear: to expose not only the inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, but also the institutional flaws that allowed such inconsistencies to persist unchallenged. Every document, every piece of recorded conversation, was a brushstroke in a larger portrait of an institution that had lost its way, a portrait in which the abuse of power had become all too commonplace. For Lieutenant Commander Isabella Cortez, each revelation was both a vindication and a burden. As she sat quietly at the defense table, her mind drifted back to the years she had served her country, a time when her actions were guided by honor and an unwavering commitment to justice. Now, facing a courtroom that was increasingly sympathetic to her cause, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Every piece of evidence that emerged not only cleared her name but also illuminated the stark contrast between the values she had fought for and the systemic failings embodied by Officer Dalton and his cohorts. In a particularly poignant moment, as the defense rested its case for the day, Benjamin Carter addressed the courtroom with a quiet intensity that resonated deeply with everyone present. "We are here not only to seek justice for Lieutenant Commander Cortez, but to demand accountability from an institution that has too often hidden behind the veneer of authority. Today, we have seen evidence that speaks volumes about the true nature of power and the lengths to which it will go to protect itself. It is now up to you, the jury, to decide whether the truth, however inconvenient, should prevail over a carefully constructed narrative that has long been used to silence dissent." His words were met with a profound silence, a collective moment of reflection as the gravity of the evidence sank in. The jury members exchanged glances that spoke of deep contemplation, their faces etched with the realization that they were about to make a decision that extended far beyond the fate of one individual. This trial was evolving into a reckoning, a confrontation between the ideals of justice and the realities of a flawed system. As the recess was finally called, the courtroom slowly emptied into the corridors and waiting areas, leaving behind an echo of whispered conversations and heavy sighs. Outside, the atmosphere was electric. Spectators and journalists gathered in small clusters, discussing the bombshell revelations with fervor and uncertainty. Social media buzzed with live updates and heated debates, the public now fully engaged in a narrative that had grown far larger than any single trial. Before the session reconvened, Benjamin took a moment to address the press outside the courthouse. "This is a turning point," he stated firmly. "The evidence we have brought forward today is not just about correcting a single injustice. It is about sending a clear message that no one is above accountability. We must hold our institutions to the highest standards, and we must ensure that the voices of those who have been wronged are heard loud and clear." Inside, as the next phase of the trial loomed, Judge Harrison's voice once again called the room to order. With a calm yet resolute tone, he announced that the court would now hear closing statements from both sides. The final stretch of this legal battle was upon them, a stretch that would test the very fabric of truth and justice in Granite City. The turning point had arrived, and every person in that courtroom felt the weight of history in the making. With emotions running high and the evidence laid bare, the trial was poised to deliver a verdict that would not only decide the fate of Lieutenant Commander Cortez, but also signal a broader call for systemic change. As the proceedings resumed, the atmosphere was thick with expectation, the silence punctuated only by the distant hum of conversation from the corridors beyond. "Which piece of evidence or testimony do you believe most shifts the balance of the case in favor of justice, and why?" The tension in the Granite City courthouse was almost tangible as the final phase of the trial unfolded. With every piece of evidence, testimony, and cross-examination having built up to this moment, the room now brimmed with an expectant hush, as if all present were holding their breath for the final word of justice. Judge Harrison, his expression grave yet resolute, called the court to order once more. "We shall now proceed to closing arguments," he intoned, his voice, carrying the weight of decades in service of justice, resonated throughout the hall. It was a moment when the scales of justice, meticulously calibrated by evidence and testimony, were about to tip toward a final, irrevocable decision. At the defense table, Lieutenant Commander Isabella Cortez sat with a quiet dignity that belied the emotional turmoil within. The years of sacrifice, the battles fought on distant fronts, and the relentless pursuit of truth, all of it converged in this final moment. Her presence was both a testament to her resilience and a rallying cry for those who believed in accountability and the rule of law. Benjamin Carter, the defense attorney whose strategic brilliance had illuminated the discrepancies in the prosecution's case, rose to deliver his closing argument. With a voice that was both impassioned and methodical, he began, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today you have witnessed not merely a trial of one individual, but an examination of an entire system. You have seen evidence that speaks of a culture where power is wielded without proper accountability. You have seen how a pattern of misconduct, concealed behind uniform and authority, can distort the very truth upon which our justice depends." He paused, scanning the faces before him, faces etched with contemplation, empathy, and a desire for change. Lieutenant Commander Cortez is not just a defendant. She is a symbol of integrity, service, and the unwavering courage to stand against injustice. For 20 years, she served our country as a Navy SEAL, defending the freedoms we hold dear. And yet, in her own community, she has been vilified by a narrative constructed to silence her and protect those who abuse their power. Benjamin's words struck a chord in the silent courtroom. He continued, "The evidence presented today, from video recordings to internal documents, reveals a troubling pattern in the conduct of Officer Marcus Dalton. It exposes a system that has too often prioritized reputation over truth and has allowed misconduct to persist unchecked. When you deliberate, I urge you to consider not only the facts of this case but the broader implications of a verdict that tolerates such abuses." As Benjamin concluded, his voice softening into a final plea, he looked directly at the jury. "This is your moment, a moment to reaffirm your commitment to justice, to say that no one, regardless of their position or uniform, is above accountability, to send a message that truth, no matter how inconvenient, will always prevail. I trust you to make that decision." A respectful silence followed his impassioned words as the prosecution prepared to counter with their own closing statement. Richard Avery, the lead prosecutor, rose with a measured confidence that had been his hallmark until the day's revelations began to erode his position. His face, once impassive and assured, now bore the lines of strain and concern. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "the case before you is indeed complex. While the defense has presented a narrative that appeals to your sense of justice, we must not overlook the facts of the incident as they were initially reported. We acknowledge that emotions run high and that systemic issues exist, but we must focus on what transpired on that fateful day." Avery's tone was measured, yet his argument wavered under the weight of the defense's mounting evidence. Officer Dalton testified under oath regarding an incident that, though interpreted differently by some, was a necessary measure to maintain public safety. The video evidence, while compelling, does not capture the full context of a situation that unfolded rapidly under stress. We ask you to consider that in moments of crisis, even the most seasoned officers may react in ways that are subject to interpretation. He gestured toward the documents that had been scrutinized earlier in the trial. "Yes, there have been concerns raised about Officer Dalton's conduct in the past, but let us not allow these issues to cloud your judgment regarding the specific events of this case. The prosecution maintains that the actions taken were in line with the protocols designed to ensure the safety of all involved. Lieutenant Commander Cortez's behavior, though she insists was calm, must be examined within the framework of a potentially volatile encounter." Avery's words were met with mixed reactions in the courtroom. A few nods here and there, but also an undercurrent of skepticism from jurors who had absorbed the defense's revelations. His closing statement attempted to recast the incident as a moment of split-second decisions, but it struggled to overcome the documentary evidence that painted a starkly different picture. When Avery finished, There was a moment of heavy silence before Judge Harrison addressed the jury. Members of the jury, you have heard both sides. You have seen the evidence, listened to the testimonies, and now you must deliberate on a verdict that will not only decide the fate of Lieutenant Commander Cortez, but also serve as a statement on our collective values regarding truth and accountability. Over the next few hours, the courtroom emptied, and the corridors of the courthouse filled with hushed discussions and anxious debates. Outside, a swarm of reporters and concerned citizens gathered, their eyes fixed on the building as if it were the epicenter of a battle between right and wrong. In a small, makeshift deliberation room, the jury convened. The jurors, each representing a cross-section of Granite City's community, engaged in intense discussions. Their debate was not solely about the legal nuances of the case. It was about the larger implications of systemic authority and the protection of civil rights. Some jurors recalled their personal experiences with injustice, while others expressed concern over setting a precedent that might embolden similar abuses in the future. After hours that felt interminable, the foreperson of the jury, a middle-aged woman with a determined gaze, finally spoke. "We have reached a verdict," she announced quietly, as the jurors filed back into the courtroom. Their expressions were a blend of solemnity and resolve, a collective acknowledgement of the gravity of their decision. Judge Harrison called the courtroom to order once more. "Has the jury reached a unanimous decision?" he inquired. The foreperson nodded, and the jurors handed over the verdict paper with careful deliberation. In a voice that trembled with both relief and anticipation, the foreperson began. "In the case of the state versus Lieutenant Commander Isabella Cortez, we find the defendant not guilty on all charges." The words echoed through the room like a clarion call. A murmur of shock and exultation swept over the gallery, punctuated by applause from supporters and sympathetic onlookers. For Lieutenant Commander Cortez, the verdict was more than a legal exoneration. It was a vindication of her truth, a long-awaited moment of justice that transcended the courtroom. As she stood, her posture unyielding and her eyes reflecting both tears and triumph, she felt the weight of years of struggle lift from her shoulders. Around her, supporters cheered softly, and Benjamin Carter offered a reassuring smile that spoke of battles fought and victories hard-earned. In the days that followed, the trial's resolution sent ripples throughout Granite City and beyond. Media outlets dissected every aspect of the case, and social media buzzed with impassioned debates over the implications of the verdict. For many, the trial had become a symbol of resistance against entrenched authority, a reminder that truth, no matter how long buried, would eventually resurface. The case spurred calls for reform within the local police department, with community activists demanding greater transparency and accountability. Internal investigations were reopened, and soon, a series of policy changes began to take shape, a tangible outcome that signified the public's demand for a justice system that truly served its people. For Lieutenant Commander Cortez, the journey was far from over. Though the verdict had cleared her name, the scars of the ordeal remained, a constant reminder of the struggle against systemic injustice. Determined to transform her personal victory into a catalyst for broader change, she began speaking at community events and legal forums, sharing her story and advocating for reforms that would prevent others from enduring similar injustices. In one particularly moving address at a local civic center, she declared, "Today, I stand not only as a freed individual, but as a representative of every person who has been silenced by those in power. Our fight for justice is a continuous journey. Let this verdict be a beacon of hope and a call to action for all who believe that truth must always prevail." Her words resonated deeply with the community, inspiring a wave of activism and renewed determination among those who had long felt marginalized. In the wake of the trial, grassroots organizations formed alliances to monitor and report on police conduct, ensuring that the legacy of this case would foster a more transparent and accountable system. Benjamin Carter, too, became a sought-after figure in legal circles, invited to speak on ethics, accountability, and the role of the judiciary in protecting civil liberties. His efforts to dismantle the narrative of unchecked authority were lauded as a pivotal moment in the ongoing dialogue between the public and those entrusted with power. As Granite City began to heal, the trial's outcome served as both a closure and a new beginning, a stark reminder that the fight for justice was not confined to the walls of a courthouse, but was a collective endeavor that spanned every corner of society. The echoes of the trial continued to inspire discussions on reform, accountability, and the importance of confronting the uncomfortable truths that lay beneath the veneer of authority. In the quiet aftermath, as the courthouse doors closed on that historic day, one lingering question remained. A question posed not only by the legal community, but by every citizen who had followed the case with bated breath. In light of this trial's outcome, what steps do you believe are essential to ensure that our institutions remain accountable and that the truth is never compromised by those in power? In the end, our journey through truth and justice reminds us that every challenge we face has the power to unite us. Amid the storm of conflict and controversy, it is our shared compassion and unwavering belief in fairness that light the way forward. Let this story serve as a heartfelt reminder that love and empathy are the strongest forces for change. Together, we can transform even the darkest moments into a beacon of hope and renewal. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this message resonates with you, please subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories and meaningful conversations.